Alrighty, RFK Jr. has officially filed paperwork to run for president, and I'm very happy about this. I'm very optimistic. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm not optimistic. I'm pessimistic, but I am happy nonetheless that RFK Jr. is in the race. I don't think that the Democrat electorate will appreciate how good of a candidate he is. In fact, I think were he to be nominated, I think he'd be the favorite to win. I think he certainly has a better chance in a general election than old Joe Biden. But his problem with getting through a Democratic primary is that he's way too reasonable. He's way too old school. He believes in actual democracy, which I don't say that necessarily is a good thing. I don't think that democracy is a great idea. But if we're going to have a democracy, I would prefer that we have someone who actually believes in it, rather than an oligarch who likes to put on a Democratic skin suit. And RFK is the furthest thing from an oligarch. Every single oligarch in this country wants him dead, and make no mistake, if he gets anywhere near the levers of power, they will shoot him dead, just like they shot his uncle and his father dead before him. But it's because of that legacy of dead Kennedys that I think that were RFK to be in office, or were he to get to a general election, let's say it was him versus Trump, or certainly him versus DeSantis, I think I would trust RFK more than the others. Even though if it was, let's say, Trump versus RFK, I probably would agree more with Trump, with what he had to say. I think I would be on Trump's side on more issues. If they had a debate, I would probably side with Trump more than RFK. But I think that RFK is a deeply sincere man, and I think that every single word that comes out of his mouth, unlike with Donald Trump, it's the exact opposite when it comes to Trump. Every single word that comes out of RFK's mouth, I think he means. And so I don't think he's going to move from that. If RFK says he's going to shut down the FBI and the CIA, which, last I checked, he's pretty darn serious. He's pretty clear about that. He's shutting down the CIA and FBI if he becomes president of the United States. That alone would be enough to earn my vote, even if I disagree with him on every single other thing. After all, I considered him to be a political enemy for my entire life until last year, probably the year before, whenever he wrote that Fauci book. And then I thought, hey, I may disagree with this guy a lot, but he seems like, he's a reasonable person, even if he has a different ideology than I do. And so even though we come at the issues of the day from two very different directions, we both arrive at a lot of the same conclusions in a lot of individual cases. And I think the most important dividing issue of our time is whether or not someone thinks that the deep state is to be tolerated, that the deep state can be reformed, or worse yet, you can't even speak to someone like this, someone who thinks that the deep state is good and just. You have those people on one side, and then on the other side, you have those of us who understand that the deep state was fundamentally evil, unconstitutional, undemocratic, and exists to turn our country, or keep our country, an authoritarian state ruled by oligarchs from the shadows. The deep state is a shadow government. The term comes from Turkey, and it was the idea that Turkish democracy could only go so far before the deep state would say, no, we're not going to have it that way. Sure, you guys might have voted for a real pious Muslim leader, but Turkey's a secular country, and the deep state would reset things. And the American deep state does much the same thing. You might elect an anti-imperialist president multiple times, someone who runs every single time. Every president runs on ending wars. Every president runs on, not invading other countries, on minding our own business. Yet, every time the deep state walks into the Oval Office and says, well, actually, we're an empire, and you don't have the power to change that. Either you can play ball, or we'll run you out on a rail. And most presidents whether it be George W. Bush, Barack Obama, no matter what they said on the campaign trail, once they got in there. In fact, George W. Bush was famously said this openly. He said, once you sit in this chair, you realize your hands are tied. And it's not really your decision. You don't get to make any of these choices. The decisions are made for you. George W. Bush said that. He said it to Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck has, repeated this story many, many times over the years, and George W. Bush has never once refuted him. He's never put out a press release and said Glenn Beck made all that up. And frankly, it's a story that rings very true. So if Bush has never denied it, I'm going to assume that Beck is telling the truth about that. But when it came to Trump pushed back on that a little bit. I think because he was naive. He was so naive to think that he really was in control of the government if he became president. And when he pushed back a little bit, they pushed back 10 times harder. And they ran him out on a rail. That's why Trump is no longer president. RFK Jr., however, knows exactly what he's getting into. He knows that these people will kill him in an instant if he doesn't watch his back. And nevertheless, he probably will still end up dead if he's able to survive the election cycle at all. And Trump, he had a shot at the White House. He was there for 4 years, and he made a lot of bad decisions, particularly regarding personnel. And so Trump has to do a lot of work to earn back my trust. As of this point, I trust RFK Jr. more than Trump on taking on the deep state. Even though I think that Trump has more of a reason now, I think that Trump is more experienced and he knows more of what he's getting into than he did, back in 2016. I think that, if Trump had a second term, his second term would be better than his first term, because I think that Trump has learned a lot of lessons. But at the same time, I think that RFK is much more politically developed. I think that he is solid. His views and his attitudes are long ingrained in him. He is not someone who's still evolving like Donald Trump. He's not someone who has to learn really anything. And even if there were things I wish he'd learn, he's not going to. He's an old man and he's set in his ways. And I guess you could say to Trump's credit, despite being old, Trump is not set in his ways. And so Trump is open to reason. But frankly, I don't. I think that that's a riskier bet. And so I think that there are a lot of people who are in that same position. Now, I think that would be a minority of people. I don't think that the crossover of people who voted for Trump in 2020, who then would vote for an RFK Jr. in 2024. Do I think that's a huge amount of people? No, but they do still matter because there were a lot of working class, blue collar Democrats, those types of people who voted for, let's say, JFK and RFK back in the 60s. Or at least were those types of people. Maybe they weren't old enough to vote or even alive back in the 60s. But they were those types of voters. They were Kennedy Democrats, and they voted for Trump. You think of the folks in eastern Ohio, places like East Palestine. Those were Democratic communities. You think certainly the Rust Belt states that voted for Trump by the slimmest of margins in 2016. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. All of those states, I think, would be the Trumpy voters in those states, I think, would be very interested in an RFK candidacy. And I think that it's possible that RFK could shut Trump out of key states that Trump needs to win. Although as it stands right now, I think that Trump is probably going to have to give up more on the Rust Belt states, especially after what we just saw in Wisconsin. Wisconsin, I think most people consider to be the closest, the most gettable state for Republicans in 2024, and they just elected by a massive, over 10-point margin, a Soros-backed candidate to their Supreme Court, and have now, turned their Supreme Court, in favor of the Dems. They also just reelected their Democrat lockdown governor to another 4 years. So Wisconsin doesn't look like it's going to be voting Trump in 2024. Ironically, though, they might just vote for someone who is even more anti-lockdown than Trump, someone who is anti-vaccine before it was cool, and that, of course, is RFK Jr. So for Trump to win, he would need to win of the swing states. What would he need? He would need Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. If he can't win any of the Rust Belt states, pretty sure that's where. And frankly, I think that RFK Jr. could make Iowa and Ohio competitive for Trump. He's the kind of Democrat that could win in those two states. So maybe even Iowa and Ohio, which are seen as deep red right now, because the current Democratic Party does not appeal to traditional Democratic voters in states like Iowa and Ohio. But Iowa has from what I understand, a pretty substantial, anti-vax movement. I think that in a primary in the Iowa caucuses, it'll be hard to see RFK Jr. Not trouncing Joe Biden. Joe Biden didn't even win in Iowa in 2020. Being a Kennedy, I think he'll certainly win New Hampshire. That's another, swing state, which doesn't get a whole ton of attention for general elections because, it's only 4 electoral votes. But anyway, getting back to Nevada, Nevada is another state that Trump has been able to turn less blue. It still is voted blue every time, but it's become much, much closer in the post-Trump era, I think specifically because he appeals to working-class voters. But you got RFK Jr. in there. I think that as considering Biden still won Nevada technically in 2020, you can say margin of fraud, yes, but you're still going to have the Democrats running that election most likely in 2024, and the Democratic Party has been willing to cheat to put Kennedys in office before. They certainly did in 1960. Even though I do think that the deep state will try and kill Kennedy, once a November election rolls around, they're not going to sabotage, the party is not going to sabotage RFK, put Trump back in office just to keep RFK out. What they most likely would do, and I'm dead serious about this, would be try and just get any Democrat across the finish line in November of 2024, and then they'll worry about dealing with RFK after that, whether it's impeachments, whether it's putting him in prison. They'll do all the same things that they did to Trump, but worse. And if that doesn't work, they'll assassinate him, and they'll just make sure that they control who his VP is. That'll be how they control RFK. They will put a George H.W. Bush type of character, because that's what they did to Reagan. Reagan's presidency was crippled from the beginning. It was never going to go, it was always going to be extremely limited on how much he could push back against the establishment, even though I do think that Reagan was someone who had good intentions. And he was wrong about a lot of stuff, but I think he had good intentions. The Republican Party saddled him with George H.W. Bush, the former director of the CIA, to essentially control the White House from the inside and put a lot of bad people around Reagan and keep Reagan on a leash. I don't think it's a surprise that shortly after Reagan was elected president, he was almost killed. He was shot by John Hinckley Jr. Even though John Hinckley Jr. says that he did it to win the affections of oh my gosh, what's her name? Jodie Foster from Taxi, or was it Taxi Driver? I forget the name of the movie. Anyway, the 12-year-old prostitute in Taxi. I don't think that it was her fault. I think that John Hinckley Jr. was most likely a puppet of George H.W. Bush and the CIA. And I think that was them sending Reagan a message. And I guess, thankfully for Reagan, he got the message. And he went along with everything that they wanted on foreign policy. Not that I think that Reagan was a big dove to begin with. But Reagan was no enemy of the deep state after that point. He was no longer a risk to them. RFK Jr., on the other hand, I think that I could see them taking a very similar playbook, putting a total deep state hack and saddling him with a VP like that. Because let's be honest, the presidential candidate, when it comes down to it, the party is going to pick the VP. And you know what? Maybe RFK puts his foot down and says no, and after that the party sabotages him. That might happen. But you know what? These are getting into really hairy scenarios, so I don't want to speculate too much. I mean, this whole video is speculation, but I mean, that's getting a little too insane. Like, okay, what if RFK doesn't let them put in a deep state mole as his VP? Then will they try and sabotage, RFK, let Trump win, and then take Trump out and try and deal with Trump's VP? Because who knows who Trump's VP is? Trump could pick someone like, what's this woman from New York? Elise Stefanik. If Trump picks Elise Stefanik, and let's say it was RFK Jr. and as his VP, he picks like Jimmy Dore or something. He wouldn't actually pick Jimmy Dore, but I'm just throwing it out there. Someone who's like Jimmy Dore, someone who is also anti-establishment. And so you have RFK Jr. and some anti-establishment VP. The Democrats go, oh my gosh, even if we push them over the edge, we can't get rid of. If we get rid of Kennedy, it's going to be somebody else too. I could see them throwing the race, letting Trump win with a VP like Elise Stefanik, a no-name Republican who can be controlled, and then taking out Trump, and then they deal with that VP. That could happen. Or they could still try and get the Democrat elected, push RFK over the edge, which again, I think RFK, very, very capable candidate. I don't think necessarily that the Dems would have to do anything illicit in order to push RFK over the finish line in 2024. But let's say RFK and his VP are both unacceptable. They would have to take them both out at once. Okay, and that's, we have the precedent for that with Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon. They didn't want Spiro Agnew to be president. They wanted Nixon gone after Watergate. They wanted to get rid of him. Although, frankly, Watergate was the excuse. The deep state wanted Nixon gone anyway. They didn't like him. He was too independent. Not that Nixon was a good guy. I don't think Nixon was a good guy. I don't like him. I think he was terrible. But he was independent, and he wasn't a deep state puppet. If he agreed with them, he'd go along with them. If he disagreed with them, he wouldn't go along with them. And so they wanted him gone, but they didn't want Spiro Agnew either. So they took out Spiro Agnew first, and they inserted Gerald R. Ford, who I believe was the Republican minority whip at the time, or maybe he was the minority leader. I can't remember which. He was Republican leadership, though, in the House. He's from Western Michigan, the most milquetoast Republican on the planet. And then once they got Gerald Ford into the White House as VP, then they could take out Nixon and allow Gerald Ford to ascend to the presidency as a figurehead of the deep state regime. And so you could see RFK get in with some anti-establishment VP. He wins, he gets pushed over the edge. The deep state manufactures some scandal, some tax thing, like with Spiro Agnew, to force RFK's VP out, isolate RFK, insert, let's say, Hakeem Jeffries, who's in Democratic House leadership, so a similar position to Gerald R. Ford, insert him as RFK's VP, and then take out RFK, and then you have President Hakeem Jeffries, who nobody voted for, just like Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was never elected anything. He was never on the ballot as the VP, I don't believe. Actually, he might have been, now that I think about it. I can't remember in 72 if it was Ford or Agnew who was on the ballot. Might have been Ford, though, or it might have been Agnew. I'm pretty sure Ford was never elected anything. Anyway, so there's plenty of precedent for this. They have the playbook. They know how to do it. So I would not. RFK's got a long road to hoe. As Chuck Schumer said, when you get on the wrong side of the deep state, they can screw you 6 ways to Sunday. And I think I named more than 6 ways just in this 20-minute video. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow, and we'll talk about Democratic primary prospects for RFK. So I'll see you all then.